Archbishop of Canterbury, Saint Theodore of Tarsus, the story of how an Eastern saint defended the Western Church. England, 668 AD. Over the course of the preceding century plus, since the Romans retreated from the island, England had undergone a series of invasions from a pagan Germanic people. The remnants of Christianity had been pushed to the far east, where, on the rest of the island, it became increasingly settled by the pagan Anglo-Saxons. And what Christianity that remained in these newly settled regions was only sparsely present. The country, it seemed, would recede back into its primitive pagan past, only for the once great faith to be a marginalized community. That is until Pope Gregory the Great, in a providential decision, sent new missions into England to reconvert the island. In this move, the nascent archbishopric set up house not in London, the growing merchant city, but instead in Canterbury, the diocese founded by its first bishop, Augustine, in 597. While an orthodox post-Pelagian faith had been planted and taken root, it faced many challenges yet. Though for the next several decades the see would be occupied by holy and venerated men, it was always under the threat of forces outside of itself. After the quick term of the Archbishop Wygert in 664, the see remained vacant for 5 years. In a time when uncertainty was the norm, there was no guarantee that the gains of Saints Gregory and Augustine could be maintained. And as it was looking, the see was likely going to recede back into obscurity. Then on May 27th, 669, an unlikely man entered England and took the chair for himself. Theodore had been appointed by Pope Vitalian, likely through the recommendation of a Berber scholar. It was a bold move, as England, always considered on the outskirts of the western boundaries of the Church, was now appointing for itself a man who was not Western. Up to that point, all the archbishops had been either native or Romans. Theodore, though, was a man born into and thoroughly of the Eastern tradition. His appointment at this moment would be pivotal for the English and the wider Church for centuries to come. Historically, there has been much attention given to his time in England, but in recent decades, historians have delved deeper into what can be known of his origins and what effects this likely had on his time forming the English Church. Born in the ancient city of Tarsus, then under Byzantine control, Theodore would have come of age in the clashes taking place between the Empire and the Sassanids. Given his proximity to this intercultural linchpin, he almost certainly would have had exposure to Persian and likely the emerging Arabic Islamic culture, as well as his native Byzantine Christianity. He was also heavily immersed in the Antiochian school of theology of this period, and would have been fluent and versed in Syriac and its own Christian tradition. He received a formidable Constantinopolitan education, having been trained in astrology, mathematics, civil law, Greek rhetoric and philosophy, the use of horoscopes, and medicine. Thanks to the military campaigns of Belisarius centuries earlier, Italy had come back into the sphere of the empire, and as a result, there were many cross-cultural interactions between East and West at this moment. Theodore was among this exchange, and in 660s he traveled to Italy and became trained in the Western traditions, both secular and religious. There is strong evidence that during this time he partook of the synod in the Lateran Basilica in 649 with Saints Pope Martin and Maximus. This synod was instrumental in combating the monothelite heresy which was consuming the East. It is very likely, in fact, that Theodore was involved in the drafting of the Acta for this event, which would later come to so influence the Council of Third Constantinople in 680. But in 669 he was to leave behind the opulence of the Hagia Sophia and the Lateran Basilica for the small provincial towns of England. and once there he wasted no time in establishing conformity to the Roman Church. The first thing Theodore did was to go about filling existing vacancies in Mercia and Wessex and East Anglia. At the time of his arrival, there were only 3 bishops in all of England, one of which he would depose himself and replace with Bishop Wilfrid. Then he began establishing new dioceses by breaking up the larger existing ones. For example, he took the single diocese of Northumbria and divided it into 3, Daria, Bernicia, and Lindsey. And there was an immediate backlash as some clergy saw this as an overreach of authority, including Bishop Wilfrid himself, who went in person to Rome to make an appeal to the Pope. This unfortunate bitter moment would later be quelled when Theodore made efforts to reconcile with the aged holy bishop. And one of his most lasting legacies, St. Theodore founded a school of learning with Hadrian. Writing of it 60 years later, St. Bede said it was one of the jewels of the island, producing Christian scholarship at a rate unknown in Anglo-Saxon England up to that point. Many of the wider customs of Christianity became introduced to the island through this school, including a deeper appreciation for the Eastern traditions, a distinctly English biblical commentarium, as well as the custom of praying the Litany of Saints. And one can't overestimate the lasting influence that this would have, as even later the Eastern tradition of venerating Our Lady as the Immaculate would take root in England, affecting later theologians such as Blessed John Duns Scotus, and in time coming to add to our doctrine with the Immaculate Conception. In 679, a papal legate for Pope Agatho arrived in England to garner support for Rome's stance against the Eastern Church, which was at that point embroiled in schism and heresy. The results of this endeavor could not have pleased the Pope more. Theodore immediately sends word throughout the diocese that all the bishops were required to attend this first of the pan-English synods. Held in Hatfield in 680, Theodore calls into the Acta an almost exact reception of the Lateran Acta from 649. He then goes on to assert all of the canons of the 5 previous ecumenical councils. This synod is a triumph in the medieval church's contribution to the orthodoxy of England. Theodore masterfully upheld English traditions while also keeping them in line with the wider church proper. And in one of the most striking moments, one somewhat embarrassing for modern Orthodox, was his upholding of the Latin filioque. At Hatfield, 680, we find here Eastern clergy, born and raised in the Antiochian school of theology, intimately familiar with the Greek tradition, in complete control of the English episcopate, failing to thwart this, according to the Greeks, creeping era into the Acta of a synod, which would go on to define and affect the lives and sanctity of the Anglo-Saxon Christian world for centuries to come. And this is why today we want to draw your attention to this often forgotten holy man of the East, who helped to guide the English Church into a more proper communion with the Roman Church and all of her orthodoxy. So St. Theodore of Tarsus, Archbishop of Canterbury, pray for us.